Hi, this is Brad Power, and this is the Cancer Patient Lab, and we're honored today to have Chris Beardmore with us. Chris is founder and CEO of Innova Enterprises, which, among other things, helps patients get access to treatments. He works in clinical trials. He'll describe his background in greater detail, but a very important part of the process for us as advanced cancer patients. Just quickly on the standard disclaimers that we have at the beginning of every meeting. This is not medical advice. This is for information purposes only, so that you can perhaps get some ideas that you can take to your medical team. And secondly, this will be made public. Everything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. No, everything will be made public, and we will be posting all of the recording and the transcript. And so if you would like to remain anonymous, please, hide your name, change something, and you can not say anything because it will be made public. So just a quick intro to Chris. I was introduced to him by Chris Schuler, who's been very helpful and is working in brain cancer and fundraising. And I was very taken by Chris. Early on in our journey, we worked closely with CureMatch, which was just mentioned in the discussion, which recommends drug combinations. And drug combinations offer perhaps a more durable response to patients, but most of the clinical trials that come up with get drugs approved are monotherapies, where they treat it by themselves. And in the scientific method, you want to control everything else and just test for that one thing. So the result is that most of the randomized clinical trials have approved a drug as a single therapy at maximum tolerated dose. And drug combinations actually are a good option, but there's no randomized clinical trial evidence for those in many cases. Increasingly there is. Increasingly, they're running trials with immunotherapies plus something else, but many aren't. And so the cure-match combinations are what is called off-label. There's no evidence that a clinician can use to prescribe that. And so they will hesitate to prescribe that, even though the patient may have decided that's really what they would like to use. And so the issue of access, once you've decided what your best treatment option is, and then the issue of access is a recurring one for our patients. And I saw that Chris had some ideas on how to cut that Gordian knot and help people get access. So his company does a lot of other things, and he'll tell us about that. But I think the issue of interest to most of our patients would be, how can Chris help with access to whatever it is that they want when it may be off-label? So with that, I'll turn it over to Chris, and he'll have, as usual, 10 or so minutes of presentation, and then open it up for discussion.
Great. Thank you very much, Brad. So yeah, I'm a regulatory person by training. I started my career running IRBs, animal care and use, radiation and safety committees at the University of Maryland, at UCLA, and for the Department of Defense. A lot of that work early on was about access. At the University of Maryland, not only were we dealing with an AIDS pandemic and what are you doing with combination therapies to try and address HIV and what was creating individuals who were so immune suppressed, but also emergency room research, terlizad mesylate, and a lot of work in the golden hour came out of that institution. At UCLA, a lot of the work was around new drugs like targeted therapies like Herceptin, Patrick Soon-Shiong working on islet cell transplants, artificial hearts, things like that. And compassionate use became something that we did quite a bit of, or even for the Department of Defense, where we were working on biowarfare protective products. And what do you do when you have national emergencies and may need something like an anthrax vaccine or an emergency use authorization of a COVID vaccine, right? So when I left academic medical centers, I started building cancer centers and was focused on how do you improve access to clinical trials, both with an idea that participation in studies probably improves outcomes, And I think some of that is probably related to improvements in technology and the precision medicine transformation, and how products are probably hitting targets more effectively theoretically and resulting in better outcomes. But it also probably comes from the rigor that's applied to clinical research and compassionate use, right? That if you have to report adverse events, you have to deal and manage those adverse events. So real quick, what I'll do is I'll share a couple of quick slides. I'm gonna start in the middle and skip past some of the precision medicine piece here. I think everybody understands that ultimately precision medicine has created a world where we are looking at therapies that have increasingly refined FDA approvals. I'd like to point to this one approval of Keytruda, right? So, right now the package insert, which is the document that's inserted into each vial of Keytruda, has all of the approved indications for the therapy. And what you used to see would be, an approval of a drug for a wide target population, right? You might see something like approval of a drug like sunitinib, Sutent, for, say, second-line colorectal cancer. What you're seeing in these targeted therapies are package inserts that cover a large number of diseases. Here you've got Keytruda already approved for melanoma, non-small cell lung cancer, head and neck, squamous cell cancers, liver cancer, cervical cancers. And each of those individual treatment patient populations have very, very specific lines of therapy and other requirements. In non-small cell lung cancer, one of, I think, 3 approvals is in combination with pemetrexed and a platinum-based chemotherapy as first-line treatment, so long as you don't have an EGFR or an ALK mutation, right? So what a patient needs to do in order to become informed any longer, and or a physician to ultimately keep all of this straight, is becoming more complex. And I would argue that at some point we're going to be past the ability of the human brain to really manage this. So finding out how to have
Is
You
it me
might
first?
pose it on you.
Yeah, okay. It's not just me.
Yeah, that's what I was trying to check too.
Yeah, it's frozen on me as well.
Okay.
Huh.
I will text him.
Yeah, he'll probably just sign back in.
Oh, something. Okay. There we go.
There he is.
All right, I'm back. I'm going to switch my internet connection if that happens again. But okay, so the second thing I was trying to say there was, if you look at the different ways that people can gain access to therapies, I largely think of them in these 4 categories, right? Certainly there are FDA authorized or approved products that are out there. And patients should be discussing treatment options with their physicians all the time to figure out what's approved or what's about to be approved. However, having said that, I would generally argue that a lot of therapies that are out there today may have been developed in the old traditional approach, where you've run a trial and you've basically said this therapy is more effective in, let's say, greater than 50% of the population. And as a result, may not necessarily be as effective as pursuing something which is more targeted. So one of the examples I've been talking quite a bit about with people is in the glioblastoma space. If you look at the STOOP protocol, which is the regimen they use for all patients with newly diagnosed high-grade brain tumors, gliomas, they will resect the tumor if they can. They will administer radiation and temozolomide based upon a study that was issued, nearly 20 years ago. And in the end, more patients will do better with that regimen than not. What is clear now that we're in this era of precision medicine is that a lot of things impact whether or not a patient's going to respond to temozolomide, right? So methylation status of the MGMT promoter is a big condition there. Whether or not the tumor can be impacted through radiosensitization, that sort of thing. And so what you're beginning to see are other mutations leading folk to believe that maybe it would be worthwhile to pursue targeted therapy in a world where effective first-line therapy is pretty limited. The second thing I was going to say is that just because a therapy is out there doesn't necessarily mean an insurance company or a physician is going to be eager to go find it and prescribe it. And so one of the things we often do is look towards patient assistance programs. And there are a lot of times where biopharmaceutical companies will provide relatively easy access to a therapy, especially if a patient isn't making millions and millions of dollars. So a good example of that would be Merck and Keytruda. Again, we've seen a number of patients with glioblastoma who have been able to get pembrolizumab or Keytruda through these patient assistance programs when their insurance companies have refused to authorize it. Of course, clinical trials are a good way to access care. Compassionate use is a good way to access care. And I would say that Inova primarily, as we work with sites, physicians, biopharmaceutical companies, and patients, tend to focus our efforts on those three areas of patient assistance, clinical trials, and compassionate use. So in the end, and I'll wrap here and let some questions happen, I tend to view the world in this way, particularly in the diseases that are aggressive or are metastatic in the way of cancer, or let's call it are serious or life-threatening. And that is, patients are going to enter a world where they should have, I think at this point, some sort of multidisciplinary team talking about what it is that they should think of doing, right? And I think for patients who have things like breast cancer or prostate cancer, where there's been a lot of money, a lot of traditional research done, and a lot of therapeutic options, the idea that multiple experts will come together and help inform where to start with standard of care becomes important. The second thing that I get into with folks is make sure there's a really strong and disciplined approach to measuring progression of disease. The number of patients we talk to who say, "Oh, I get scanned, twice a year," even though they know they have, metastatic breast cancer, and I go, "Well, why are you waiting?" Right? If a disease is progressing and getting larger or metastasizing or whatever, the number of times you can turn the engine and try other therapies is limited. And in the clinical setting, one of the things that's a bit surprising to me is that use cancer as an example. Radiologists don't always use very precise measurements to try and assess progression. So in clinical trials, you'll get RECIST or you'll get RANO measurements that are very explicit. They track X number of lesions in X number of organ groups, and they ultimately come back and say, okay, your disease has gotten 5% larger, let's go ahead or 10% larger, let's switch therapy. Whereas in the clinical setting, a lot of times we see a radiology report that looks a whole lot more like a lot is happening, but I'm not quite sure. And maybe you should talk to your doctor about what to do next, which is less helpful. But anyway, my point here then is once you get into this world of standard of care and a group of people or yourself who are informing with your physicians what you want to do, I think the question then becomes, as you progress, can you move in a directed fashion from the things that are approved that we know have a high likelihood of working, right? So if you're going to get first or second line therapy and that therapy has an 80% chance of working for you, by all means, go with standard of care. It's got a high likelihood of being successful. If that doesn't happen, then I would argue that targeted therapies, even if they're investigational or used off indication, is a way to think about addressing a progressing disease. And if not, then go to the things that are more non-targeted in their approach. And you can run through these loops in a very systematic way, and attempt to land on those therapies that are most likely to generate a complete response or a partial response, or move away from toxicity to those things that work. So, all right. So I've been babbling for my 10 minutes. I should probably stop for a second and see if there are questions. But yeah, I'm happy to kind of take this wherever anybody wants to go, into patient assistance programs, compassionate use, how that works, clinical trial access. What are you most interested in?
And as usual, since everybody here, I think, has been in these sessions before, if you use the raise hand feature, and I'll call on you in turn. While I'm waiting for that, thanks, Chris. Oh, Brian's ready. Brian, go.
So, Chris, I really liked your last slide. Thanks for putting that together. I think it's a really succinct way of looking at a patient's decision-making process. I'm just curious, have you modeled that? So, for example, if a patient were to come to you and say, hey, I've had these 6, 7 lines of therapy, some are standard of care, some are targeted, et cetera. And then they also provided you with targets that are based upon DNA alterations, RNA alterations, or RNA expressions, or proteomic expressions, or other data. Could you model for the patient what is the next best treatment option for him or her? Because that is
the short answer is, I think that's the holy grail. That's the brass ring, right? And the short answer is that we can't at the moment, although we are moving in those directions. So 2 areas where ANOVA has been focusing our efforts are in the adult high-grade glioma environment, right? The glioblastomas, also in Lou Gehrig's ALS, right? And generally, I think it's because, well, sorry, and I would add a couple other ones. I think if you look at pancreatic cancer, I think you can do the same sort of thing. I think it's much harder when you're looking at, breast cancer, prostate cancer, colorectal cancer these days, due to just the sheer volume of therapies that are out there. But the short answer is, right now we've been trying to load the system in those areas where we've been focusing in, with a large number of opportunities, so that when patients hit these inflection points, that we can meaningfully help. And so, as an example, in the GBM space, we're running now 3 clinical trials for patients with, newly diagnosed glioblastoma. One is a cell-based therapy, one is an immunotherapy, one is a small molecule that crosses the blood-brain barrier. We then have pursued 2nd and 3rd line opportunities, as well as relationships with companies like Kantara and ERC and Neonc on their compassionate use opportunities, to kind of sit back and say, look, eventually, standard of care is limited in this area, right? Beyond the Stoop protocol, probably bevacizumab, which doesn't change survival. It just, kind of improves symptomology. And maybe CCNU, right? Lomustine, these kind of chemotherapy drugs that are relatively toxic. There's not a lot for a patient with GBM. So you almost want to consider clinical trials early. You want to try and do things like look at biopsies and look at, the mutation burden and H3K27 and IDH1 mutations, and then try and come back to people and go, well, here are your options. Which ones of these do we think are most likely to be effective? In the end, I think that's going to be essentially a learning system, right? And I guess the question is who controls and manages and works within that learning system. I think from discussions we've had, Tempus and Foundation Medicine and Caris and other kind of proteomic, sorry, I'm going to use broadly omics, right? Omics providers, whether that's DNA, RNA, or quantitative proteomics in some way, believe that it will be them. But I'm not positive that's the case. I think that what we should be probably moving to is something we call N=1, and get large volumes of patients moving through their journey, and then look for the signals of where they're finding success, and double down in those areas. And yes, some of that will certainly be genomics, but some of that may be order of therapy. Some of that may be anatomical and access, right? In GBM, it may be what treatments can you really deliver across the blood-brain barrier. And the short answer is that's where we all should be running towards. And in the meantime, patients are stuck in this environment where the best they can probably get is a multidisciplinary team that says, I think the next best thing for you is X. And how can Inova provide access to those therapies via whatever, by hook or crook, so to speak? Does that help, or is that too babbly a response?
No. I think what you're saying is very consistent with our philosophy and what we're trying to do. But it is very complicated. It's a real challenge just to build like a real world evidence database that can provide the foundation to build models, which can then be used for decision analytics and to help patients.
Correct.
We're not
Correct.
there.
And I think the FDA is shying away. Go on, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, we're just it's there are a lot of barriers. Even when a patient such as myself brings like just incredibly a ton of data to the table with recommended treatment options, there's still this preference almost or bias towards standard of care, towards chemotherapy as opposed to a targeted immunotherapy or something like that. So it's just there's a lot of dynamics at play, but empowering patients to make these decisions is, I think, really, really important.
100%. And I would say that you're absolutely right. I mean, look at those incentives, right? Do I blame a physician at Duke or Hopkins or UCLA? And I'm just randomly throwing names out. Not that any of them have behaved well or poorly, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're daily faced with clinic schedules that are going to be 20 or 30 patients, right? Yeah. So let's say that they buy off on all the literature you bring in, right? So you haven't brought them, let's grind up peach pits because, the arsenic in there will help us all out, right? You've brought in something that's truly evidence-based. Now you're going to ask them to begin doing work. And in the patient assistance world, that means getting a billing professional to reach out to that patient assistance program and ask for the drug. And a lot of them are doing it effectively, right? There's a client group we have in Los Angeles called OPN, and they take on financial risks. So they're working with insurance companies, and they're just responsible. If you get cancer in these insurance programs in Southern California, you may land up in one of their practices. And they will sit down when a drug is requested off indication by their physicians, by patients, whatever, and say, look, is it reasonable? Is there any evidence that this would work, right? And if it meets NCCN guidelines, all the better. If it doesn't, then the question is there anything known that's better out there? And if you can't make the argument, then they're totally willing to go to an insurance or to a biopharmaceutical company and say, hey, look, can I have access to a PI3 kinase inhibitor because we see that target here, and we've looked at the Caris result, and the active driver of this tumor appears to be this PI3 kinase mutated variant of the disease. Mm-hmm. Similarly, we were surprised. We had a very large insurance company where the standard of care for this brain tumor patient, this GBM patient, second line was bevacizumab. The cost of bevacizumab is $14,000, $15,000 a month, something like that. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't change survival. And we wrote a note to the insurance company and said, look, I can get compassionate use of this drug from this other company for this particular mutation. They want to cover the cost of their drug. It's $2,000 a month versus $14,500 on average. Would you be willing to cover that cost? And they said yes. Now, I think that's a shocking development, but a shocking good development. And I think that we're going to see more and more of that happening. The last thing I was going to say is compassionate use right now is still incredibly burdensome on everybody, right? So, a compassionate use request takes around 120 hours on the site side and a similar amount on the sponsor side. So Inova, when we got out the gates, we sat back and said, well, we'd love to have a learning system. We'd really love to help patients make better decisions on what's the next thing in their journey. But if you can't solve the operational issue of like every study is available at every site, so you don't have to have a patient move from, even in LA, moving from UCLA to USC to Cedars-Sinai is not an easy exercise for a patient or their family or their caregiver. So you've got to solve the the operational issues first, and then you can start building the other pieces. And that's where we are in our particular journey at the moment, which is we're really good if a tumor board or a group of professionals has come back and said, hey, if you can find an MDM2 targeted drug that would really help John Doe, please get out here and help us do that. We can get those on clinical trial or in compassionate use in 60-70% of the cases we request. Yeah, and so we've been doing that ad hoc, pro bono, as we learn and try and bring to the world a transformative way of working. And I guess I would say the last thing, which is, in the end, I believe this is all going to work very similarly to let's use Uber, the car driving service, as an example, right? When they were early on, they had to set up a black car service in New York and San Francisco, right? And so, now here you are, and they could, you could get a relatively wealthy person who needed to get around the city a ride, right? But eventually they had enough cars and enough whatever that the path of least resistance was hopping in an Uber versus a taxi cab. And I think eventually that's going to be happening in our field, right? I would argue that the genomics or the omics providers are not going to be able to keep carving up the landscape the way they have. They're going to have to come together and provide an informative report to physicians and patients that let them know what they could consider acting on. And then there'll have to be other groups like Inova who are in the mix here at the site and the sponsor level, delivering those trials in real time. And we're getting there. We're a year and a half ago, it was all a wonderful theory. Now we're doing a lot of this. But
that's awesome. You got your finger on the pulse, and so thank you for all that you're doing. You're headed in the right direction. So thank you. I'll let others jump in here.
But last thing I was going to say to people is, I'm not entirely certain that you can make wrong decisions if you're a patient, right? In the sense that if you look back at MD Anderson ran a trial about 10 years ago where they had a phase 1 program, and they randomly assigned patients to whatever was the next phase 1 study that had an open slot, versus one where they had a tumor board sit down and make an informed decision as to what it was that would best help the patient. And I didn't think it was all that surprising to find out that if you had a tumor board who said, oh, this person has an ALK mutation, this person has an EGFR mutation, let's put them on the new EGFR targeted phase 1 study, they did better. So in my opinion, and they did better like 30 or 40% above the other population, right? So I think patients should be constantly doing this, right? I mean, I'm doing it today with my mother, who has a fairly rare mantle cell lymphoma with blastoid characteristics. It is a very aggressive, very terminal disease. And they're all talking about, let's re-challenge with the BTK inhibitor that we tried before that didn't work. Well, she won't be at that facility much longer. I will transfer her to a place where we can try something else. It may be CAR T therapy, it may be another targeted agent, but I believe we will get a better outcome than trying the same old stuff, because it's just the easiest thing to pull off the shelf. So anyway.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks for your perspective.
Yeah, no worries.
Vanessa's up next.
Yeah, just two quick questions. The first is, of your patient population now, kind of, can you break down the percentage of what type of cancers? I mean, you named a few that you're focused on, but if you knew like proportion wise. And then the second question is just as a practical matter, how do patients engage Inova, and, what's the cost associated, those sorts of things?
Sure, absolutely. So I'd say right now about 30% of what we're doing is in the GBM space, and then the rest of it is going to break down in following through the diseases of cancer that are bad, right? So pancreatic would be next, colorectal and non-small cell lung cancer would be next, and then about 10 to 15% of what we're doing is in the neuro space. Weirdly, when we came out and we launched the platform, we launched it about a month before COVID. So originally we were almost 99% patients who had COVID infections who were on ventilators delivering risperidone, or Cellularity had a program with natural killer cells that actually was very interesting, and we published on. So the short answer is, yes, we don't do a lot of marketing, and we tend to drive towards again those diseases that have limited outcomes. on our side, we care very much about what are the drivers, and we think that the drivers, like that Uber analogy I was giving you earlier, are going to be the drug companies who have the resources to develop their products and are looking for more efficient ways to find out whether their treatments are safe or effective. Sites and site networks, who we have a number of customers where we're doing that. That includes groups like Mary Crowley in Texas, where we have all of their phase 1 studies available for patients. It includes groups like QCCA and Exigent, their networks of community practices, and then academic medical centers like and hospitals like Hackensack Meridian Health in Jersey, or UC Irvine, where we have a good relationship with Danielle Aboda and others there. Lastly, we have the patient thing, and we have two types of patients that get to us. We actually have agreements with groups like Private Health, which are patient navigators, right? They're groups that sit down and say, you know, we're going to go out and get all of the omic testing we possibly can, and we're going to use that information to make some recommendations with patients and their care providers, and they hire us to go find those therapies for them. We also have pro bono stuff that we do for patients as well. I'd say we probably have between 5 and 10 at any one time. So the short answer for you is I don't know exactly, you know, who it is in your family or what you're dealing with, but if you send a summary to me via email, I'm happy to provide some options and do that to try and help out. We're making plenty of cash on the GBM studies we're running for sponsors that are helping us to learn and do more of this. Eventually, our goal in the next year or two is to have what we call our EMPI operating, which would be a place for patients to be able to come in and say, hey, look, this is my situation. Where would be a good doctor for me to go? Because my physician has said, you know, they're just not interested in anything other than standard of care. We didn't think we needed that originally, but unfortunately, yeah, we're finding that some physicians are not movable. So giving patients the ability to get to a like-minded treatment provider seems to be of need. So we hope to have that up in Q1 of next year.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries at all.
That's been an interest of ours, Chris. We may have talked about. I know Glenn Sabin has been interested in pulling something like that together as well. It's a common problem: is we know what we want, but we can't get a doctor to prescribe it.
Totally agreed. And like I said, I mean, and I guess I'm in public here, so I should be a little cautious with my language. But you know, we have run into physicians who will lean into this, right? I do believe Danielle Aboda at UC Irvine in the GBM space. Sam Singer, who's actually at Northwell Health, is an amazing individual. Francis Chow and Tom Chen at UC Irvine, or USC, excuse me. There are a lot of places that I think are willing to help. It's just how do you make those connections?
Chris, you have kind of referenced a few examples, case examples of where you've been experiencing things. Would you mind taking like one or two patient stories and just sort of taking them from soup to nuts, you know, so that people here can sort of imagine what that journey looks like in working with you?
Yeah. So there's a patient, MB, who lives up in Portland. She was diagnosed with a grade 3 astrocytoma. She went ahead and did her surgical resection and treatment with temozolomide. She approached us and asked if we could help her, and so she worked with that group I mentioned, Private Health. Private Health came back and said, we think these are the following most optimistic targets for her. One of those in her case was a mutation called IDH1. And so we reached out to one of our clients, which is a group called Neonc Technologies. They have an inhalable version of pearl alcohol. And with that tumor being IDH1 mutated, we said, would you be willing to do compassionate use? They reviewed it and approved that request in, I don't know. Well, actually, I take that back. I'm sorry. I should say that her physicians up there in Oregon and Northern California were not supportive of the request. She actually ended up with a physician in Southern California named Jose Carrillo, who works with a guy named Santosh Kasari at St. Joe's Hospital in Orange County. And they put in a compassionate use request, which we approved. And she's been receiving that therapy now for 10 months with no evidence of progression. I'm not sure again how long she'll receive benefit, but it's been going, swimmingly for her as best I can tell. Another example on the other side, we've done quite a bit of work for companies that have drugs that are targeting EGFR and HER2 mutations, in particular exon 20 insertions. And one of the things that we're doing right now for a Chinese company called Daizol is working with sites to identify in a just-in-time fashion those patients who have non-small cell lung cancer who are newly diagnosed for one of their trials or are in the second line therapy who share that EGFR exon 20 insertion mutation. And we've now identified and enrolled patients at 5 sites over the last 2 months. And again, we don't do the genomic testing, right? So, they're getting a report from somewhere, Caris or something through their physicians. But when the physician cares enough or the patient cares enough to say, hey, look, how can I get access to this? We've set up with the CROs and the company a mechanism to have that study open within 5 to 10 working days. So we use private IRBs, which tend to be faster. We have an accelerated clinical trial agreement template that we use so that we don't have to go back and forth and negotiate nonsense in contracts. We have a robust budget so that the sites don't have to complain at all. We just need to get this done. And the company seems to care and see value because they might spend an extra $500,000 running the trial on site startup fees, but anyway, but they're going to lose $1 million a day. The drug's not on the market, frankly, right? So let's get the thing done and identify the patients as quick as we can. So there's two quick examples.
Thank you. I just migrate this conversation a little bit into how we might collaborate, unless anyone else has other questions. But Vanessa's here. She's a personal instantiation of the expansion we have into GBM, which you've mentioned is your primary area. So we're setting up a discussion forum on our discussion platform where GBM patients can come together and share announcements of things they've seen that are going on in the world, advice on, as you were just giving, sort of the wisdom that comes from like, who are the good doctors or who might be the good facilities, what are the good tests, what are the good treatments, whatever it might be. Sure. And so we are working with Cancer Commons and the Al Musella Foundation. And so they also are advising people on the molecular biology and treatment options. So we're putting together a suite of services. It would seem that yours would be complementary. Again, there's some actual overlap in some points, but then the way that you're getting into access is, I think, unique and distinctive to our group. So any just thoughts you have on how we might work together?
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing a lot of folk wanting to have something happen. I think Chris is one of them. Obviously, that's how we got connected, Chris Schuler. But we've met amazing people who are now, the survivors of family members who've passed from, say, GBM. Barb Crowell in Orange County, her husband had a GBM, and they were probably the most informed and aggressive in pursuing therapies. And he lived for quite a long time, I think, due to their impressive efforts. Tariq Khalil, who lost his son in San Diego, who's somebody who's gone into Congress and is looking for funding and all of that. But my point is, we've already begun trying to bring those groups together, and we'd like to, I'd be happy to hand them to you all. But I think one of the pieces is there an information and education source for patients that ultimately can help them get an idea of the landscape? And I think that while some of those resources exist, certainly there's clinicaltrials.gov. It's not quite, cancer.gov at the NCI. It's not quite what people are looking for. So I think that needs to happen. The second thing I was getting at is I would argue that we should all be working together to find a way to do some sort of basket trial or learning system, right? There's no reason at all why we should be exposing hundreds of patients to standard of care arms that they don't want anyway, and that are really slowing down these trials. And I would argue that, you know, and I was going to say earlier in the discussion with, I think it was Brian, but I think the FDA is being very subtle in their language, and we have to work pretty cautiously through this, right? Because I think the FDA views, for example, real world evidence as unreliable data, that they equal the same thing, right? Because nobody's checking it, nobody's filling gaps in data, nobody's monitoring it, nobody's querying it. So if you talk to FDA and say, well, let's build an external control group that is in fact monitored and that we could use to advance all of these therapies in a bad area, pancreatic cancer is one, GBM would be another, then you could create an acceleration in learning that would be pretty darn impressive. So the short answer is, I would say, for those who want to do education and websites, that's not what ANOVA does. We've just been trying to fill the gap because so many patients come to us and they're just frankly confused about what to do from beginning to end of that journey. But when it comes to those adaptive trials and going back to groups like, well, even like Tim Clousey and the group at UCLA that put together, what is it? I think they're calling it an adaptive GBM thing, but it's been running for 7 years. We haven't seen an actual protocol yet. Like, let's get those things done. So if we can help in any of those ways, we're eager to. And I did send an email last night. I'm happy to share with Vanessa if she'd like to join the group, or you guys want to. I just want to jumpstart that discussion and get them going while we try to figure out the operationalizing of access, because that is, I think, what will come crashing into each other over the next year or so. Did that help, or Brad, was it too babbly?
No, that was very useful. Vanessa, would you comment, because I'm curious what it looks like from your perspective?
I'm like trying to bite my tongue over here because I really all of that message really resonates with me. And if you haven't met Al Musella, you definitely need to connect with him, because sort of your learning trial and learning system that you discuss is something that he has. He had his own brain tumor virtual trial that he ran through his website for years, and that amassed thousands of patients. And then I think he came to the point where he realized this is bigger than just GBM, and this requires advanced AI to match those omics with those combination therapies. And so he sort of helped spin off XCures, if you're familiar with XCures, and he's a consultant for them now. And I think that's what they're trying to do. And I don't know how much I can share about it because not all of it's public, but I do think that very much is the future, whether it's through XCures or through another company. And the biggest problem we face right now is, as GBM patients, even if we can get XCures or Cancer Commons or whatever other organization, ANOVA, to recommend these combination therapies for us to try, whether they're still investigational or off-label, just the access it's unreal, the barriers we face in trying to get access. My husband flew to UCLA today. We're in Florida, and he's flying to UCLA just to establish patient care to see if he potentially could enroll in a trial at Recurrence. We need to do.
It's frustrating, absolutely, and let me back up. Part of why I was saying we've been doing a little bit of work on the ALS side is because these serious and life-threatening illnesses tend to do something which is somewhat unique, and that is they're horrific experiences for people, right? But the second thing is, till now, most of those patients pass away. And when they pass away, people don't necessarily want to dedicate the rest of their lives to the suffering they just went through. So they lose their voice, right? And that voice is hard to convey going forward, but is important, right? Meaning, I would never, and I mean, this is a hard statement. I'm going to say it as a never, but I probably don't believe this. I would never participate, if I got a GBM, in a clinical trial of a company that didn't have a compassionate use program. You don't get my benefit. I'll go pass away quietly somewhere, right? Because the obligations need to be there. And when you see some of the behavior, and you can see a lot of this in Biogen IDEC did this, it's well documented in the press. I'm not giving away anything. We worked with a woman named Lisa Morello, who had a SOTA1 mutated ALS. and they wouldn't give her compassionate use. Now, their trial was fully enrolled. They claimed there were all kinds of unfair reasons why she should get access to the drug, while there were people in a standard of care arm that was kind of watch and wait. And my point was, nobody wanted to deny her a chance for a good outcome. And yeah, it's hard, but I think the GBM community, the pancreatic community, the ALS community, the Duchenne's muscular dystrophy community, these groups are going to get to a place where they say no longer, right? You can make an extra 5,000 doses, and so long as we're accruing the trials, you know what I mean, so that you get your answers as quickly as we can, and we get these drugs approved as quickly as we can, you owe us something slightly in return. And anyway, we'll see. I mean, I believe that'll get there.
Yeah, and the one thing I do see, which we've experienced firsthand, is like one of the investigational treatments that we wanted to access. It's in phase 2 trial now. We reached out to the manufacturer and said, can you create an expanded access program for those that don't qualify for the trial? And the response we got was, we don't even have enough money to continue, to complete our phase 2 trial at this time. So we definitely don't have money for this expanded access.
Agreed. And that's exactly the sort of thing that we could fix, right? So my question becomes, and again, I don't want to be hard on people, right? Because groups like PanCan and the ASCO, they do amazing work, right? But could those groups come together with a pool of money that helps biopharmaceutical companies to manufacture enough drug for a compassionate use program? If we did have an expanded access IND, could we talk to the FDA about how to make all of those products available when patients have run out of options? And I don't think that the FDA would want to turn any of that off, right? I talk to people, I go to dinner meetings, not dinner meetings, I go to friendly social events, and people go, we'd have a cure for stuff if companies really wanted it, right, Chris? And I go, no, you guys are insane. If I could get a cure for GBM today and have it approved, I'd be one of the richest people around. Trust me, I would love to do it if I could, right? But my point here is that the FDA is not looking to say no either, right? Richard Pazder set up Project Facilitate. They review and approve compassionate use requests that we give them in usually around 2 hours. Okay, that's how fast the FDA can move. And they do. They don't disapprove hardly anything. So, and I don't mean that. I mean, we do very, very informed requests. So I would have the experience of them approving everything we submit because we're really good. But my point is it's not the experience where they just tell us to shove it and a patient should go off to hospice. So I think these groups should come together and say, look, I'm not going to invest another $3 million into basic science work to find a new target when I've got 40 companies who have drugs and they just can't get them to patients because we have a manufacturing issue here. Let's get that run done and let's get those products out. Or let's put, I don't know what it's going to cost, $300,000 into a compassionate use program and 3 administrators who process those cases for those companies and collect data so that we know in real patients how they do. And again, I think that in the end, XCures and Cancer Commons and Inova should all come together in one big, solution, because I think we do a better job of getting treatments to patients in real time, and they're doing amazing things in their journey work and their data work. I mean, the stuff that XCures is doing around children with diffuse midline gliomas is important, and the academic medical centers haven't solved those issues. So anyway.
Thank you. Glenn, you waved your hand.
Yeah, we are trying to develop a list of what we call either pioneering prescribers, of N1 prescribers that are open-minded to providing access, not only as through compassionate use, but also combinations, et cetera, whether these are academics or more likely community providers. You had mentioned a few names, Chris, and if you'd be willing to share, any additional names, maybe offline via email or what have you, that would be wonderful, because that really is a challenge. And then you have the challenge of the reality of the economics when the community provider who is typically even more stressed than the academics. When they're investing the time to go after all this unbillable, unreimbursable time to kind of go after these agents or combinations thereof and discuss it internally through tumor board meetings to feel somewhat comfortable or comfortable enough to pursue this. They also don't get reimbursed for, paid for the drugs, right? There's no way to mark that up based on how they get the drug. So these are all these rate limiting kind of factors. But I think that starting with a list of prescribers would get us further along the way to then being able to address these other factors.
Yes, I agree and happy to help. And I think in the end, that's the sort of transparency that in the end we're hoping that we'll see, right? In a world where you have, drug companies on one side or medical device manufacturers, you've got sites and physicians on another, and you've got patients and maybe regulators. So those four groups. The question is in a world where you don't know anything about what's going on, who's responsible for what doesn't happen? And right now, they all point at each other, right? I mean, the right to try debate was mostly about biopharmaceutical companies saying, if it wasn't for that darn FDA, I'd have a compassionate use program. And now we've got right to try and single patient expanded access and all kinds of mechanisms that would work. And now it's about, I don't have any drug, or I don't have a person who can process that request. So, in my mind, I see everybody being graded, right? I mean, is an academic medical center a leading academic medical center if they won't have a robust offering of clinical trials for all patients down all lines of therapy, right? And you can't open 20 studies a year and think you're going to be great, right? I was shocked. I had a call with an academic medical center in the let's call it mid-south of the United States, and they said, we have a wonderful phase 1 program here for our cancer patients. We have 3 open and accruing phase 1 trials. And I said, I have no idea what you're talking about. That's not success. How many people are going into 3 trials with 3 patient cohorts? 6 a year?
Yeah.
You're an academic medical center covering a state. You know what I mean? Like you need 40 phase 1 clinical trials and 200 trial offerings, right? And we're fighting over governing law in a contract. We're fighting over a study startup fee of $15,000 versus $10,000, right? I mean, what we need to be doing is, and so my point here was I was getting at was that if every patient could go into a clinical trial, first of all, you would probably have a lot more free drug provided. So you would have a decrease in cost to the healthcare system overall. A lot of those sites are exposed to risk, right? They buy that drug from Cardinal Health or AmerisourceBergen or whatever. And if they don't get reimbursed, they pay for it. So they've got to collect 11 times, let's say, for every patient that they have not pay them, right? And then these studies are robust, right? It's, phase 1 trial in cancer might pay $40,000 or $50,000 a patient who's on trial. So if you sat down and said, all the people that we gave an off indication drug to went on a clinical trial with that drug instead, you would get a research payment, you would get free drug, and you would get all the clinical billing for all the scans and laboratory and doctor stuff that you normally do. And that's a much better financial picture for a site than where they are today, frankly, I think. But anyway, sorry, I'm on my soapbox. I apologize.
We're just about out of time. Rick Stanton had a question in the chat. Rick, is there anything you'd like to ask or comment?
Comment. Thanks, Chris.
No worries.
I really liked your flow chart. That was really cool. I've done flow charts similarly. I liked yours. Very nice. I saw the ability to overlay kind of like a Napoleon, was it Napoleon's War or some type of famous war where you see this all these people or army guys, so the line was big And then at the end, the width of the line was relative to the number of soldiers in the battle.
Sure.
So I saw that you could maybe show, rather than all the same width lines, and here's the paths, what paths do the patients really tend to go down? Like, this is one patient, this is 100 patients.
So that's a really cool idea, because I agree. I think yeah, absolutely. And yeah, short answer is absolutely. I think that's in Tufts' book. Okay. Yeah, I'll take a look at it, because I would yeah, I think that would be correct, right? Because in the early part of a disease, by definition, in theory, you should be pursuing probably more standard of care options than not. Although I would argue that those standard of cares, plus or minus a research drug, would be helpful, particularly if your chance of efficacy starts dropping below 60%, right? But yes, that would be great. I'm going to try and get that book there real quick. Tufts.
Yeah. So that would be one part that would be handy. The other would be the decision criteria to move, left or right, to make a decision, which path. And I think that's what we were all talking about.
Decision trees.
Those were my comments.
Agreed. Yeah, that's a hard one, and I would love to talk more about it. One of the things I thought was interesting was there was a guy at FDA whose name's going to escape me, but who eventually I think went over to Flatiron. But they had a very decent program where they were trying to look at decision making in medical record data. So Flatiron had a large source of data from community oncology practices, and one of the things that they were trying to do is say, the imaging occurs and then the patient does something, right? Either they stay on the therapy they were on before, or they transfer over to some other therapy. And long story short is that in the medical record data, they said it was pretty hard to figure out why a decision was made, because there were a lot of cases where scans would show progression, but a physician decided to keep treating. And I would bet that the reason why is that a medical oncologist will make a decision sometimes that slow progression is better than unfettered disease progression, right? And so they're making some of those decisions, but I'm not positive those communications are always with patients, where you sat down and said, in the most binary sense, if I can prove that you've got a new site of disease or you've got progression of any tumor by 10%, do you want to switch therapy? I think patients would probably almost always say yes, or keep what I'm on and add something to try and target that new thing. And so anyway, so my point is that I want to put some time to your thought there, because I think it's a very smart one. I'm just not quite sure how you define the lines when patients might have different opinions as to what they want. But
the slow progression always equates to failed treatment these days.
Correct. And it may not, right? I mean, if I could slow progression of disease in children with diffuse midline gliomas that have recurred, where their chance of survival past 5 months is near zero, getting to a year or 2 years is quite meaningful, even if it never stopped it. Now, by interest too, by the way, there's a lot to happen in how do you evaluate how disease is progressing. You may have noticed that there's a new RECIST version 2.0 that just came out, I believe, or RANO 2.0. I'll circulate that to Brad so we can share it with the group. But my point is, they still consider standard a stable disease to be not a response.
Wow.
Stable disease is not a response. And so, we're going to have to figure that out, because, again, it's an equivalent of what my dad said when I was a kid, right? If I could get somebody to give me a loan today for $1 billion and I have to pay it back $1 a month, it's a great loan, right? So if I could get my disease to stop spreading, one day I'll die of a heart attack or get hit by a bus. That seems like a pretty good option. But anyway, so but I'll share that that was just published by Patrick Wen at Harvard maybe 2 weeks ago, so I'll get it out to the group.